break it up into 3 parts and put it in the appropriate places. And the appropriate places, which hopefully you are aware, are now on the segment labels in the map. I wanted to put them at the beginning or the end, and I just felt that the easiest place for people to find them is when you click on this. It's supposed to take you to, what is this? Oh, I know, sorry. If you click on this, it will take you to the program label for that segment, and that's where the videos are. It just makes them easier to find.
It's been very helpful.
Oh, good. Well, I got one right then anyway. So that the Web of Wonder segment, the intent was to provide an introduction to a systemic perspective without a lot of overloading technology and theory and concepts, more an experiential exposure to things, and you can let me know the extent to which you found that it actually worked to do it, so that it was to initially offer a model which I thought that almost anyone could connect with in terms of the bird feeder dilemma and what happens when you simply think about a situation and you decide to do something with regard to that situation and not think about all of the implications associated with it, and then to provide a couple of examples of the difference between what you can experience with a static picture and dynamic simulation models, and then a few thoughts, probably mostly my own, about how it is that we learn things by extending the models that we develop over time, and then providing a foundation for saying that all of the modeling that we do essentially is based upon 3 basic fundamental structures, which are provided in the Essence 1, 2, and 3 segments of this. And then just to talk about model construction and this essence of and approach to sort of evolving the understanding of something piecewise by looking at what the interactions are, what is it that this influences, and what influences it, and what else does it influence, and on and on. So it was meant to be sort of experiential as opposed to deep conceptual systems thinking theory, which tends to really drive people nuts. I tell people that I spent over 3 decades with people asking me what I did for a living, and as I tried to tell them, you could see their eyes glaze over, and you could see the story running through their head of saying, why did I ask, and how do I get him to stop, and then one day somebody asked the question, and without actually realizing it, I said, we figure out how to solve problems so they stay solved and not create new ones in the process. And they said, well, that's really interesting. We want to know more. And I was at a loss for words because that had never happened before. So, some things take longer than others to sort of get a handle on. So that, is that absolutely true? Well, it's the intent. In other words, we attempt to better understand the situation and the implications of things so that we can intervene in a way that really ends up addressing the situation and not being our own worst enemies by creating new problems that we have to deal with tomorrow. And I find that rather than trying to explain what systems thinking is, when I approach the situation from that perspective, people seem to be open to wanting to know more. So any questions about the Web of Wonder segment itself, the individual pieces that were in it?
Not for me. I'm still exploring.
Okay. Well, and the nice thing now is you can explore it whatever pace is comfortable to you. I apologize for MailChimp newsletter that went out on Monday that I'm still figuring out how to learn, and I screwed up the salutation in all of them, so it didn't have people's names in them, but I got that piece figured out. You can expect them to come out every Sunday, simply as a nudge to remind people that, you know, encouraging you to at least find a little time to progress through the sequence. And the first few weeks were extremely chaotic. The amount of things that we got wrong initially that people provided very good feedback on and caused us to alter and change the way that this program operated has begun to settle down a little bit, so that, I mean, the date on the updates element hasn't changed since the 17th. I mean, that's like 4 days now. That's awesome. So, okay. I like questions. Make some up.
Dean, if you're talking to me, I'm still in the, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into mode.
Oh, well, we don't let that overwhelm you. Ask questions. Ask as many questions as you feel you need to, and then ask a few more. And don't worry about posting them to the discussion group. All of the people there to this point, I have not yet run into one person who's participating in this program that believes they are a legend in their own mind. And
well, that's reassuring.
And if we find one, they won't last long. I mean, the intent is it's amazing how much I have learned from the participants in the last 3 weeks. I mean, somebody asked a question about, can I do this with Insight Maker? And I told them no. And then and 5 minutes later, somebody posted a model, and I said, oh, I forgot that. So it's an opportunity for us to collectively figure out how to understand better, and we'll work at it. So if you feel completely overwhelmed, just send me a mail message and we'll chat. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
I guess you know what I'm doing on the holiday weekend.
So I'll be here.
Okay.
There are some people who believe I'm actually online 24/7. It just looks that way. Okay. So, well, all right. Even though it doesn't, I'm not sure that I need to. Let me cover Essence Property 1, 2, and 3 simply because I think that they're extremely valuable to understand and ensure that you know. The idea was that, believe it or not, in 1937, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who is considered by most to be the father of modern systems theory, first proposed that there were basic underlying structures that operated across all branches of science, and that if one learned how these structures operated, one could take much of their learning from one discipline to another. All they'd have to do is learn which structures were operating and what the labels were. And when I first read it, I thought that was pretty ludicrous. Though after pondering it for some time, it was the realization that if there is one universe and all these disciplines of science are a fabrication of man as opposed to nature, why wouldn't the same set of structures operate everywhere? And it took from 1937 until Senge published the fifth discipline in 1990 for them to actually get labeled systems archetypes. And there's a section that we'll talk about that we'll go through in 6 or 7 or someplace that's specifically about archetypes, though essence property 1, 2, and 3 are essentially the most basic of the archetypes possible, from which all of the rest of them are simply multiple instances of them integrated together. So the idea was to provide a set of pictures to provide a sense that while these are all extremely different situations, there is an essence about them that is the same, in that they all represent a quantity of something. And that quantity of something came into being because of something that flowed into it to cause it to increase, and it would decrease because of something that flowed out of it. Now, this particular model is a stock and flow model, as opposed to a rich picture or causal loop diagram. Rich pictures are the easiest types of diagrams to create because there are no rules. The problem with rich pictures is there are no rules, so that oftentimes after you create one, you have to explain to people how to interpret it. Causal loop diagrams have a set of guidelines as to how one should go about creating them, and if you give someone a causal loop diagram and they understand causal loop diagrams, they should know how to interpret the diagram that you've given them, though there's still an amount of hand-waving and smoke and mirrors that you can get away with in terms of causal loop diagrams. Stock and flow diagrams are very rigid, well-defined, explicit rules for how you create them, and there's no way to hide anything, because the only way that a stock can change is because of an inflow or an outflow. There's no magic here anywhere. So in these particular instances, the way that the dump becomes the dump is because of one truckload after another, and it piles up, and the only way that you get rid of it is that you dig a hole and bury it, or you truck it out, but it just doesn't evaporate. And the sense was that if you actually interact with this diagram, if the inflow is greater than the outflow, then the stock increases, and if the outflow is greater than the inflow, then the stock decreases over time. And if the inflow and outflow are the same, the content may change, but the amount of it doesn't change. So the idea was to provide a sense of probably the most basic model that you can build that is a real simulation with stocks and flows to provide a sense of how it works, and also provide an opportunity for you to interact with that model by changing the initial value of the stock and the inflows and outflows and running the simulation over again as many times as you like. Now, the real benefit about Insight Maker, the thing that I like most about it, and probably the primary reason that Scott created it, was that it makes it extremely easy to build and share models with other people, because if I built this and I want to give it to somebody else, all I have to do is send them this URL. And when they receive it, they can interact with it and they can run it. All of the tools to change it aren't here because they won't own it. I mean, this is what happens if you own it. Though in Insight Maker, if you find a model that you're interested in manipulating, enhancing, changing, all you have to do is click Clone Insight, and you can make a copy of that model that belongs to you, just as though you created it, and do anything you want with it.
Oh,
So
cool.
I didn't mean to clone that one, but that's okay. I can go get rid of it later. So it makes it very easy to build and share models. And from my perspective, a model is a simplification of reality intended to promote understanding. And the extent to which it does that, it's a good model. And if it doesn't if it simply makes things more confusing, then it's probably not a very good model. And after doing this for decades, I continue to admit to people that I never get them right the first time. It's an ongoing learning interaction between the model and myself in terms of describing what I think and then thinking about it and realizing that it doesn't quite make sense or hold together. So I work on it some more, and when I run out of ideas to do to it on my own, I try to explain it to somebody else, not with the intent of trying to show them how smart I am, but hopefully they will ask questions that I never thought of that will cause me to figure out how to make it better and improve the understanding beyond where it was before I explained it to them. So that's the whole intent of models from my perspective. Once you get into a situation where there are more than one or two simultaneous interactions, I can't keep track of it with a paragraph. I need a picture that shows me what the interactions are so I get a sense of what's happening. So this is essence property 1, which is the inflow and outflow are not dependent upon what's in the stock itself. The way that you might think about the flow of a river into a lake is not dependent upon the amount of water in the lake. Now the outflow might be dependent upon the amount of water that's in the lake. And so, you know, this is stock independent inflow and outflow. When I go to essence property number 2, the idea was to look at a number of situations which have a similarity, and that similarity being that all of the things in this picture exhibit a characteristic of growth. And that is something that is created because we begin with the stock independent flow, and we add a feedback loop to say that the flow is now dependent upon stock, so that the amount of whatever it is that's in here, the greater the amount of stuff, the more that the inflow is. So it's a reinforcing feedback, which is responsible for this exponential growth curve. And this is just an extension of it to add a factor that controls the extent to which the feedback comes into play, so that you notice that before it was a direct influence and it added up to 1024, which is just 2 to the 10th, which meant it just doubled every time period until it ended up. And in this one, there's a setting on that factor so that it's still an exponential growth curve, but not nearly as large, so that then you can actually go ahead and interact with this model also to see the difference of initial values and the value of the factor. But this is considered to be a reinforcing feedback, where the amount of the quantity of whatever it is that's in the stock causes the flow to increase. So this is an exponential growth structure. You could also have an exponential decline structure, in that something could decline more rapidly based upon the amount of stuff that there was. It would just, you just turn the flow around and have it go out. So it would work in the same way. And the third structure by looking at still another set of things in terms of a commonality amongst them. People tell me to stop using amongst because it's an old English form. There is a goal to be accomplished and some activity that is meant to move the current situation towards the goal, so that if you have this as a goal and you begin at 0, the value of the stock increases over time as the flow gets smaller and smaller. And the reason being is that the flow is dependent upon the difference between the goal and the stock, which you can see once you look at the structure. This is the same structure as the reinforcing growth structure, but what's added to it is a goal, so that the flow is governed by the difference between the goal and the stock. You can see that if you look at the formula. It's the goal minus the stock times the factor, and the factor is just a variable between 0 and 1. So that is a goal-seeking structure. The interaction between the components, the flow attempts to bring the stock into a balance with the goal, and once the goal is reached, there's no more flow. So you now have a stock-independent flow, you have a reinforcing structure, and a goal-seeking structure, and that's it. I mean, that's all there is. You can't identify any additional simple interactions other than those three.
Quick question there, Gene.
Yes.
And this one here, how would you apply that to, say, the thermostat that keeps the room temperature?
Well, in that if you, and I think there's a thermostat model someplace in segment 4 that this is the setting on the thermostat, and this is the setting in the temperature in the room itself, and the assumption is that the room is colder than what the thermostat is at. So the difference between those two causes the furnace to run and add heat into the room. So that as it adds heat into the room, the difference between this and this gets smaller and smaller. And when it finally gets to a point where it's equal, then the furnace doesn't run anymore. Though we know from the real operation of a thermostat that it runs a little above and then it shuts off and then it cools down to a little bit below, because you don't want the furnace to cycle on and off constantly, so that there's a variance in there that it is allowed for. So the goal-seeking structure is the thermostat structure. Okay. Yeah. Kevin asked about the progress, and it's when you enter one of these segments, it's from the green segment to the red segment, and somebody reminded me that doesn't do much for colorblind people. So I went back and added all of the arrows. And the dashed lines, which I have also come to understand don't show up in all browsers because of the nature of the software, and the developers are working on that. The dashed lines mean that this element is optional, so that you follow the primary path, and as you look at some of the other ones, there will be more optional items on them. And in some of them, there will be some double arrows, meaning it goes from here out to this, and then it's meant for you to come back. And that's probably on the next one that I'll talk about. Yeah, Kevin, I can understand how one initially overrun with this environment might feel a bit overwhelmed, because it's difficult to find a parallel for it. What the metaphor that we had in mind for months and months and months was a subway map, a metro map, that wherein each one of the lines on the map was a learning thread put together from reusable components. The piecewise makeup of this has a lot to do with the fact that I'm a tremendous fan of Khan Academy. I really love the way that he has chunked all of the learning into 6 to 10 or 12-minute videos. So we tried to do the same thing and tried to sequence them so that each piece is sort of a bite-sized chunk that you can get a hold of, and the sequence itself conveys a larger concept. But the metaphor was built on a metro map, and this was the first piece of software that we had been able to find and actually encourage them to develop that allowed us to build a metro map that was this fluid. I mean, you could just use a drawing package and create something very rigid, though it needed to flow, and it needed to make it real easy to evolve the connections and integrate other stuff into the environment. So that's sort of why we're here. And any other questions about the Web of Wonder segment?